Hey, what's up everybody? My name is Nicholas Corcel and you're watching The Literary Nomad. Today we are finally wrapping up our series on 2666 by Roberto Bolaño. Specifically, we are going to be taking a deep and close look at part 5, the part about Archimboldi. One common misconception that I think is super important to clear up before we dive too deeply into this part is the notion that this part was written as Bolaño was dying. And while this book right here, 2666, is Bolaño's parting words to the world, to the literary world as a whole, this part was actually written first. This is the first part that he completed of the novel. So he wrote it in an almost linear fashion, more or less, and when he died, he was actually working on the part about the crimes. What this means is that in this part, more than any other part of the novel perhaps, the words that Bolaño uses are the most accurate to what he intended. It could be argued, I don't know if I would agree, I haven't researched it enough, but it could be argued that in the part about the crimes, as he had to stop working on it because of his illness that eventually led to his death, he had to stop prematurely. You could argue that maybe some meaning was lost, some of his true intention was lost. Well, I think that this work is a masterpiece and stands on its own legs as such. You could make that argument because the author never really got to have that opportunity to say, you know, here it is, it's done, release it into the world. But the part about Archimboldi being written first is what he wanted it to be. This is his definitive thoughts on the family of the readers. From a structural standpoint, this part is very similar to the rest. So what we do is like we go through a part, we go back, we go through telling the story from a different angle. So we'll be going forward here, we come back, go this way, go forward, go back, go this way, go forward some more. You know, we repeat that over and over again. The difference being in this part, say we stop right here, and usually we go this far back. In this section we went way back. We go back to the 1920s, I believe, might have been the late 1910s, and when Hans Rieder is born, when Archimboldi is born right before World War I, and we go all the way until the year 2001. And this idea of history, this bookend of history, you know, World War I and 2001 being two of the most historically significant days, or not days, years in modern human history, I think are very significant because the idea of history and the importance of understanding and being nuanced in history, but specifically history of humanity, so more so the history of the atrocities that man is capable of committing upon other men rather than, you know, tsunamis, earthquakes, natural things. Thinking about World War I, World War II, which almost was the complete destruction of the entire world, the Holocaust, you know, all the way up till 9/11 in 2001. These ideas that humans can inflict this incredible, meaningless violence against each other is really cannot be personified in any way that's clearer or more easy to digest and comprehend than the mass femicides of the women of Ciudad Juárez, or in the context of this book, Santa Teresa. And so on the most basic of levels, in this part we get to just learn about the entire life of Archimboldi, this guy who is a writer that the academics, or the critics, I guess if we're wanting to kind of fall in line with what Bolaño says about them, what these critics, this guy that they almost view in, for lack of a better word, or without fearing sounding a bit melodramatic, the guy that they view almost as their religious prophet, or tracing his life throughout birth until death, over 100 years, or almost 100 years of his life. As we go through this, we begin to see some connections between Archimboldi and the crimes in Santa Teresa or Ciudad Juárez. The most obvious is his connection to Klaus, his nephew, who we kind of are led to believe is maybe not the mastermind behind all of the murders, which I'm of the belief, and I think most are, that there is no one guy that's behind all of the murders in Santa Teresa, but rather he's almost certainly responsible for some of the murders, a decent amount. Like there's like 4 or 5 that are pretty obviously for him, but also the inherent violence that is within Archimboldi himself, right? We see this guy who is, again, almost put at a religious level to the critics at the beginning of the novel. So our first introduction to the novel, our first introduction to the name Archimboldi is from a tone of reverence. And he's birthed through this act of violence, through killing, through this just carnal desire to express that evil side of humanity, and through that he's able to produce this great art. But then we kind of get this linkage back to the part about the crimes, where for the murderer their function is to commit crimes, for the writer their function is to write and produce these masterworks. So then we have this likening of masterworks to these atrocities in Santa Teresa. Now obviously Bolaño isn't saying that they're good, but we're talking about this idea of function within different groups of people, this idea that these people are fulfilling different aspects of the human condition, of that human psyche, and they're doing it to the maximum level possible. And by linking them to the two ideas together, Archimboldi and his nephew, or you could say broadly the art world of Western Europe with Santa Teresa, we're linking and we're likening rather these extremes of human expression, because while they are, polar opposites, one's here, these two things hold up consciousness, free will, these core tenets that make us human. And in many ways, this is the great universal truth, for lack of better phrasing, that we're left with from the whole novel. Another really interesting thing that I spent a lot of time thinking about after reading this book, I finished it a few days ago, is how this part feels after the part about the crimes. So this was written first, as we discussed at the beginning of the video. So he could have placed it anywhere, right? He had this section longer than any of the other sections. And so throughout the entire time that he spent writing the book, he was able to think and decide where he wanted to put this, and he decided to put it at the end. And that does a lot of really interesting things, in my opinion. The first and perhaps most obvious thing that it does is it creates a foil, but also I'd argue a false foil, with the part about the crimes. The part about the crimes is so violent and so aggressive and so repetitive with its violence that it almost becomes boring. You get bored of the violence. You start to, like I've said in that video, you start to glaze over as you're reading. You start to flip pages without reading them fully. At least that's what I did, admittedly. There's no point in lying about it. Like, it's tough to sit there and read every word of it, because it starts to feel pointless. Okay, it's just another dead woman, another dead woman. These are the things that you start to think when you're 100, 200, 300 pages in. That same thing happens in this part with his life and these embedded, nested narratives. Again, I mention in every video, but Leaf by Leaf does a great video where he talks extensively about the embedded nature of the narrative in this part specifically. He includes a lot of secondary sources, which I really appreciate and I think is helpful. So I would definitely suggest that you guys go over there to learn a little bit more about how he was structuring the narrative, how he's in conversation with other thinkers, because I don't think I could do that justice. But this kind of creates the same feeling, the embedded narratives and all these things, that the part about the crimes did. So the part about the crimes bores you through violence. This bores you through the mundane reality, I guess, of publishing houses, of Western European intellectualism. And so we have these two polar opposites that are becoming equal, and they're being equated. They're causing the same guttural reaction in the reader, right? If you're reading this book, you probably self-describe yourself, as an intellectual or as somebody who enjoys grappling with ideas. And Bolaño is able to make you feel the same way talking about women being brutally murdered as he does going on long diatribes about the publishing industry. And I think, we can sit here and we can talk for hours and hours and hours about how and why and really the technicalities behind how that happens. But at least for my reading experience, it inarguably does happen. And really, you can stop your thinking there. I wouldn't. I think it can be an interesting thought experiment, but you can stop your line of thinking right there and say, and just acknowledge he was able to do that. And just that fact, the fact that he was able to do that makes this book a masterpiece and worth anybody reading. And this book has taken me a long time. I've moved country several times. I've moved city. I finally have settled into some semblance of an adult life while unpacking one of the most life-changing novels that I've ever encountered. And honestly, it was a lot, and there were times where I had to set the book down for weeks, but this is the perfect book, I think, to read as you enter into adulthood, to really start to understand, or maybe not to understand, I think that's a wild overstep, but to start to grapple with the ideas, the great ideas of humanity. The second thing that is accomplished by this part being last is that it disrupts any notion of a linear narrative, and it creates almost a circle. It creates this idea where you finish the book with Archimboldi leaving for Mexico, which is kind of where we began with the critics, and so now you end where we began. It makes you want to go right back immediately before you can really chew on these ideas and digest the violence that you have really thought about, so it makes you want to shovel more into your mouth before you have the chance to swallow and digest what you've already encountered, leading to this feeling or idea of the sensory overload, the informational overload that we experience in the modern world, and this notion that we would rather scroll another TikTok or watch another YouTube video or Netflix or whatever before we understand what we'd already consumed. I'll watch the evening news and hear one crazy story. I don't sit and think about that because I'm already on to the next thing, the next show, the next TikTok, whatever that may be. This is able to recreate that in a way that is really predictive, I would say, almost, of the times that we now live in. And so in summation, we're not really left with a murderer. We're not left with this idea of, yes, he did it. And of course, like, knowing Bolaño, I didn't think that we would get that. The closest we get is in this very classic Latin American way. We get this like familial look at who might be with Hans and Klaus, this multi-generational familial thing, which you kind of see in Cien Años de Soledad as well, which I just actually made a video about last week. So you get that, but there is no there's nothing that wraps it all up with a bow. And I think really it's predictable, but that's the reality of the world, right? The endless violence, the endless crimes, the endless works of art, the endless stories that everybody encounters on a daily basis, they don't lead anywhere. They're not taking you down a path where there's a house at the end where you enter and it explains everything. No, they take you down a long winding road, and that road, if it ends, it may not end, but if it does end, there's nothing there. And above all else, I think that's the point of 2666, and that's why we should all be reading books like this, and books that are trying to tackle these big ideas, or at least to grapple and wrestle with them.